Hey everyone! Tonight we're cracking open history's most explosive secret. What if I told you that in medieval Europe, the most joyful, prosperous, and influential individuals were frequently women who consciously opted to live without men? Not pitiful old maids or helpless widows, but sharp-minded businesswomen who flat out rejected marriage and constructed commercial empires instead. Here's the mind-blowing twist. They flourished so spectacularly that medieval society actively attempted to wipe them from historical records. Tonight, their extraordinary tales are finally being resurrected. Before we plunge into this astonishing world together, I'd be thrilled if you'd hit that subscribe button, but only if these buried stories genuinely captivate you. Quick poll, where are you tuning in from tonight? Snuggled in bed with tea? Taking a study break? I read every comment, and your personal stories always brighten my day. Now, let's dim the lights and journey back 700 years to meet women who'd make today's entrepreneurs look like beginners. Picture this: London, 1287. You're strolling through Cheapside Market when something extraordinary catches your eye. The most successful merchant stall isn't run by some burly guild master. It's operated by a razor-sharp woman named Marjorie de Clare. She owns 3 shops, 2 houses, and just finalized a French wine import deal worth more than most nobles' annual income. Here's the jaw-dropper. She's never married, has 0 plans to change that, and according to court documents, she's living her absolute best life. Yes, that's an actual quote from a 13th century legal parchment. But wait, it gets better. Marjorie wasn't some rare anomaly in medieval London. City records show that 23% of all property-owning merchants were unmarried women. 23%. That's nearly 1 in 4 thriving businesses run by women who chose independence over matrimony. These numbers come straight from the London Guild records preserved in the British National Archives. Now, here's where this story becomes absolutely earth-shattering. These women held a legal status called femol, literally meaning woman alone. But this wasn't a term of pity. Oh no, this was essentially a superpower. While married women legally became invisible, their property, money, even their legal identity belonged entirely to husbands. Unmarried women could own land, sign contracts, sue in court, and travel freely. They possessed rights married women could only fantasize about. Let me introduce you to Agnes Sampson from 14th century York, basically the medieval equivalent of a venture capitalist. She ran a textile empire spanning 3 nations, employed over 200 people, and her miraculously preserved business letters reveal a wicked sense of humor. In one letter to a partner she writes, "Marriage? I'd rather kiss a plague rat. My gold stays in my purse. Thank you very much." But here's what will truly shock you about these medieval boss ladies. They weren't lonely. They weren't desperate. Court records, personal letters, and even church documents show women hosting dinner parties, traveling extensively, maintaining deep friendships, and living remarkably fulfilling lives. The diary of Isabella de Furts, who owned vast English estates in the 13th century, describes her daily routine: mornings managing properties, afternoons studying with scholars, evenings entertaining friends with music and storytelling. She writes, "I wake each day grateful that my choices are mine alone." Now you might wonder, if these women were so successful and happy, why don't we know about them? Here's where the story takes a dark turn. As these independent women grew more visible and prosperous, medieval society basically had what we'd now call a collective meltdown. How dare these women prove marriage wasn't necessary for female happiness? How dare they succeed in business? How dare they be so infuriatingly content? The backlash was swift and deliberate. Church leaders began preaching that unmarried women defied God's natural order. Legal scholars wrote treatises claiming women living alone endangered social stability. Even language itself got weaponized. The word spinster, which originally just meant a woman who spins wool, a respectable profession, gradually became a derogatory term. Society was literally rewriting the narrative to make female independence seem tragic and unnatural. But here's what I find most remarkable. These medieval women saw right through society's manipulation. In a 1342 letter, Merchant Eleanor de Montfort writes to her niece, "They call us unnatural because we threaten their natural order. Let them. We know the truth, that a woman's worth isn't measured by the man beside her, but by the life she builds with her own hands." These women grasped something modern psychology is just confirming. Authentic happiness comes from living by your own values, not society's expectations. They realized being alone doesn't mean being lonely, that independence isn't selfish, and that choosing yourself isn't a consolation prize. It's often the grand prize. What strikes me most isn't just their business success or accumulated wealth, but their unshakable confidence. Medieval chroniclers seemed baffled by their complete lack of shame about their choices. Historical accounts repeatedly describe unmarried women as surprisingly cheerful, remarkably content, and unnaturally confident, as if happiness without a husband was some medieval miracle. But perhaps their most powerful achievement was creating networks of mutual support. They formed business partnerships, shared resources, and built what historians now call chosen families, communities of women supporting each other through business ventures, illness, and old age. The beginnings of medieval Belgium and Netherlands, who we'll meet next, took this concept and turned it revolutionary. Because what these forgotten women discovered 7 centuries ago is something we're still learning today. That the most radical thing a woman can do isn't to find a man who completes her, but to realize she was never incomplete to begin with. So settle in, because our journey is just starting. Next, we're traveling to the misty lowlands of medieval Belgium, where a group of extraordinary women didn't just choose independence. They created an entire alternative society centuries ahead of its time. What the Beguines built will completely den fu ni doi zhong shiji sheng huo de soyo ranger. Welcome to 1230 Flanders. Morning mist clings to cobblestones as you approach what looks like a small village within Bruges. But this isn't just any neighborhood. This is a beguinage, and what you're about to witness will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval women's liberation. Here's something that will blow your mind. While the rest of Europe debated whether women had souls, the Beguines had already created the world's first feminist communes. These weren't nuns bound by religious vows, nor were they waiting around for husbands. They were something entirely new. Independent women who basically invented having it all, about 700 years before modern feminism existed. But here's the kicker historians still can't believe. By 1320, there were over 200,000 Beguines across northern Europe. To put that in perspective, that's larger than most medieval cities. We're talking about a movement so massive it created parallel societies where women lived, worked, and thrived completely outside traditional marriage structures. Let me tell you about Margaret Porret, a Beguine from 1250s France who was so ahead of her time, it's almost supernatural. While most people couldn't read, she wrote philosophical treatises that wouldn't seem out of place in modern universities. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, explored concepts of personal freedom and spiritual independence so radical that church authorities burned her at the stake. But here's what they couldn't burn. Her ideas survived and influenced mystical thought for centuries. The brilliance of the Beguine system wasn't just individual success stories, it was the structure itself. These women created what modern sociologists call intentional communities centuries before the term existed. Each beguinage was essentially a gated community where women could live safely, work productively, and age gracefully without ever needing male protection or approval. And their business model? Pure genius. The Beguines dominated the textile industry across Flanders and Germany. They didn't just spin wool. They controlled entire supply chains. Historical records from Bruges city archives show that by 1300, Beguine workshops produced 60% of all fine cloth exported from the region. 60%. These women weren't just participating in medieval capitalism, they were revolutionizing it. Here's what really gets my pulse racing about the Beguines. They solved problems we're still wrestling with today. Work-life balance. They crafted flexible schedules allowing both productive work and spiritual contemplation. Retirement security? They established mutual aid systems where younger Beguines cared for elders. Affordable housing? They built beautiful, sustainable communities that lasted centuries. Beatrice of Nazareth, one of the movement's founders, wrote in her journals about the great freedom of Beguine life. She describes waking each morning knowing her day belonged entirely to her. No husband to serve, no children to chase, no male relatives to obey. Her writings reveal someone experiencing a joy and purpose almost unheard of for medieval women. But perhaps the most shocking revelation about these medieval boss ladies? How they mastered what we'd now call work-life integration. These women weren't choosing between career and spirituality, between independence and community, between financial success and personal fulfillment. They were having it all simultaneously. A typical Beguine might spend her morning weaving exquisite silk, her afternoon in philosophical debate, and her evening making music with her chosen sisters. The economic impact of the Beguines was so massive that when King Philip IV of France tried suppressing them in 1312, textile markets nearly collapsed. Ghent Guild records show cloth production dropped 40% within months of the suppression attempts. Export revenues plummeted as neighboring regions began poaching Beguine workers with better terms. The king was forced to reverse his policies because, surprise, surprise, you can't destroy the economic backbone of your region just because successful women make you uncomfortable. What fascinates historians most is how the Beguines flew under medieval misogyny's radar for so long. They were too economically valuable to suppress, too spiritual to condemn as heretical, and too independent to control through traditional means. They'd found the perfect sweet spot, revolutionary enough to transform lives, yet diplomatic enough to avoid the fate of other women's movements crushed before they could flourish. Letters between Beguines preserved in European archives reveal women not just surviving, but thriving emotionally. They write about deep friendships, intellectual stimulation, financial security, and what they repeatedly call the joy of belonging to ourselves. These weren't women making the best of bad situations. They'd actively chosen what they believed was the best possible life. Here's something that'll give you chills. Many Beguines lived into their 80s and 90s, almost miraculous for medieval times. Medical historians theorize their lower stress levels, strong community support, financial independence, and freedom from repeated childbirth dangers contributed to exceptional longevity. They weren't just living better. They were literally living longer because of their choices. The Beguines proved something the world took centuries to accept. Women's happiness and success didn't depend on male approval or traditional family structures. They demonstrated that given proper opportunities and freedoms, women could create lives of extraordinary richness and fulfillment. But even these successful women operated within a system that fundamentally didn't want them to exist. Their story is one of brilliant adaptation in a hostile environment. However, some medieval women didn't need alternative communities to wield power. Because coming up next, we're entering the shadowy world of medieval politics and commerce, where widows didn't retreat into mourning, they stepped into power. The stories of these wealthy widows will show you how much influence a woman could wield when she had both independence and inheritance. What they achieved from positions of power will leave you questioning why we ever believed medieval women were powerless. Step into the opulent chambers of 14th century Venice, where behind heavy silk curtains and golden candelabras, some of Europe's most powerful figures made decisions shaping empires. But here's what'll knock your socks off. Many of these power brokers weren't the bearded merchants you'd expect. They were widows, and they're about to rewrite everything you thought you knew about medieval female influence. Meet Caterina Cornaro, the Venetian widow who didn't just inherit a fortune, she inherited an entire kingdom. When her husband, the King of Cyprus, died in 1473, instead of dutifully mourning like society expected, she stepped into his crown. For 15 years, she ruled Cyprus so skillfully that Venetian records describe her as more capable than 10 men. But here's the kicker. She voluntarily abdicated, not because she was forced to, but because she'd negotiated a deal making her one of Europe's wealthiest individuals. Now you might think Caterina was some rare exception, but prepare for your assumptions to be obliterated. Medieval widowhood was actually the ultimate power-up for women. Inheritance laws across most of Europe stipulated that widows automatically gained control of one-third to one-half of their husband's entire estate. We're not talking pocket money here. This meant land, businesses, political connections, and crucially, complete legal independence. The Venetian state archives reveal something extraordinary. By 1400, widows controlled approximately 35% of all privately held wealth in Venice. 35%. These weren't passive inheritors sitting on dead husbands' money. They actively expanded empires, launched new ventures, and wielded political influence that made powerful men tremble. Let me introduce you to Alessandra Strozzi, a 15th century Florentine widow whose business letters read like a medieval corporate strategy masterclass. When her husband died, leaving 5 children and substantial debts, society expected quick remarriage or financial ruin. Instead, she took over the family banking business and turned it into one of Florence's most profitable enterprises. Her correspondence, preserved in Florentine state archives, shows a woman trading currencies across Europe, negotiating political marriages for her children, and casually lending to nobles desperately needing her financial backing. Here's what really excites me about these widow bosses. They understood leverage in ways that would make modern CEOs weep with envy. Take Margherita Dettini from 14th century Prato. When her merchant husband Francesco died, he left her not just his fortune, but his international trading network spanning London to Constantinople. Rather than selling the business, she expanded it. Records show the Dettini company's profits increased 60% within 3 years of her taking control, during the Black Death no less. What's absolutely fascinating is how these widows navigated politics. They couldn't hold official titles or vote in councils, but wielded influence through what historians call soft power diplomacy. They hosted dinners where trade deals were negotiated, arranged strategic marriages, forging political alliances, and used financial resources to support causes advancing their interests. English royal records tell of Joan of Kent, widow of the Black Prince, who essentially ran England's foreign policy during her son Richard II's minority. Though lacking an official title, foreign ambassadors knew major decisions had to go through her first. Her household accounts show expenditures on intelligence networks, secret diplomatic missions, and what can only be called medieval lobbying efforts. Here's something that'll astound you. These powerful widows often chose to remain unmarried even with numerous suitors. Why? Because remarriage meant surrendering hard-won independence. Under medieval law, everything a widow owned would transfer to a new husband upon marriage. So these brilliant women faced a choice: surrender power for companionship or maintain autonomy and rule their own destinies. They chose power. Isabella de Fortibus, whom we met earlier, actually rejected marriage proposals from 3 different kings. 3 kings. Her response to the last proposal, preserved in English National Archives, is absolutely savage. I have tasted the sweet wine of independence and find I have no appetite for the bitter bread of subjugation, regardless of how golden the plate upon which it is served. The economic impact of wealthy widows was staggering. Medieval English tax records show widows were among the largest contributors to royal revenues. They funded crusades, financed cathedral construction, and bankrolled exploration expeditions. When King Edward III needed money for French campaigns, he didn't go to Italian bankers first. He approached London's wealthy widows, who collectively loaned him over 50,000 marks, millions today. But perhaps their most remarkable achievement was using wealth to support other women. They established dowry funds for poor girls, created business opportunities for fellow widows, and essentially built networks of female economic empowerment. The records of Margaret Potton show regular payments to her Sisterhood of Independence, a network of women supporting each other's ventures. These widows also revolutionized philanthropy in ways still influencing us today. Instead of just donating to churches as expected, they funded education, healthcare, and early social services. Florentine widow Francesca Pitti established the first known scholarship fund specifically for girls' education in 1456. Her endowment contract explicitly states, Education is the greatest gift one can give to ensure a woman's independence. The sheer audacity of these women is breathtaking. They operated in a world officially considering them inferior to men, yet accumulated and wielded power most medieval men could only dream of. They proved that when women had resources and freedom from male control, they could not just compete in medieval politics and commerce, they could dominate it. What strikes me most is their strategic thinking. They understood their power had an expiration date. Society was always seeking ways to undermine successful women. So they built institutions, created lasting legacies, and established financial structures that would outlive them. Many charitable foundations they created operated for centuries, with some still existing today. These extraordinary women transformed personal loss into public power. In doing so, they created a blueprint for female independence centuries ahead of its time. But even as aristocratic widows reshaped society's highest levels, something equally revolutionary was happening in ordinary towns' marketplaces and workshops. Because while noble widows inherited power, another group of medieval women were building independence from the ground up, one brilliant business deal at a time. The stories of these medieval businesswomen, the original self-made women, will show you female entrepreneurship didn't begin in modern times. These guild mistresses, merchants, and innovators created empires that would make today's startup founders look like amateurs. Their secrets to thriving in a male-dominated world remain surprisingly relevant today. Listen closely, because you're about to hear the sound that changed medieval Europe forever. It's not the clash of swords or tolling church bells. It's the rhythmic click-clack of Marjorie Kemp's counting beads as she calculates her daily profits. The year is 1393, and this illiterate woman from Norfolk, England, has just become one of medieval history's wealthiest self-made entrepreneurs, all without a business degree, male mentor, or even the ability to read her own contracts. Here's what will absolutely blow your mind. Marjorie started with nothing but a failed marriage and burning determination to never depend on anyone again. She launched her first business, a brewery, with borrowed money and sheer grit. Within 5 years, her ale was so popular she supplied taverns across 3 counties. But that was just the beginning. She then diversified into grain trading, started a pilgrimage travel business, and eventually became what we now call a medieval venture capitalist funding other women's startups. Canterbury Cathedral archives contain her business records, and they're staggering. By 1420, Kemp's enterprises employed over 300 people, generated annual revenues equivalent to roughly $2 million today, and her personal wealth rivaled minor nobility. Now, you might think Marjorie was some one-in-a-million genius, but prepare to have your assumptions shattered. Medieval guild records reveal unmarried businesswomen weren't rare exceptions. They were everywhere, dominating entire industries. In 14th century Paris alone, women held leadership positions in over 100 different guilds, from silk weaving to goldsmithing to beer brewing. Let me introduce you to Rose of Burford, the medieval equivalent of a tech disruptor. In 1340s England, she revolutionized the wool trade by cutting out male middlemen and dealing directly with Flemish buyers. Her innovation? Creating the first known international quality certification, personally guaranteeing English wool's grade with her own seal. Merchants in Bruges would pay premium prices just for the rose seal of approval. Her model was so successful that within a decade, dozens of other women copied her direct export strategy. But here's where these medieval businesswomen get truly impressive. They weren't just successful individually. They created entire support networks. London Guild records from 1378 document something called the Sisterhood of Commerce, an informal association of female merchants sharing market intelligence, providing emergency loans, and collectively negotiating better supplier terms. Modern business schools would call this strategic networking. These medieval women were doing it 600 years before Harvard Business School existed. Christine de Pizan's financial records reveal another fascinating business strategy. Besides being Europe's first professional female writer, she was a savvy entrepreneur who understood brand building before the concept existed. She didn't just write books. She created a multimedia empire. She designed her own illuminated manuscripts, controlled distribution channels, and even licensed stories to traveling performers. Her account books show she earned more from business ventures than writing, making her perhaps history's first successful author-entrepreneur. Here's something that'll give you chills about these medieval mavens. They used negotiation tactics that wouldn't seem out of place in modern boardrooms. Take Denise Lacordaire, a 14th century Parisian rope manufacturer. When male competitors tried undercutting her prices, she didn't engage in a price war. Instead, she cornered the market on premium hemp, forced competitors to use inferior materials, then launched what can only be called the medieval equivalent of a branding campaign emphasizing her rope's superior durability. Within 2 years, she'd eliminated half her competition and doubled profit margins. The ingenuity of these women is breathtaking. Matilda of Scotland, a 12th century merchant, invented what historians believe was the first installment payment system for luxury goods. Unable to compete with male merchants' lower upfront prices, she allowed wealthy customers to pay for silks and spices over time with interest. This innovation spread across medieval Europe, essentially laying groundwork for modern consumer credit. But perhaps the most shocking revelation about these businesswomen is how they handled what we'd now call work-life balance. Unlike married counterparts juggling business with household management and child-rearing, these independent women could focus entirely on their enterprises. The Diary of Agnes Sampson describes her typical day: mornings reviewing accounts, midday negotiating with suppliers, afternoon visiting workshops, evening planning expansion strategies. She writes, "I wake each day knowing my time is my own, my profits are my own, and my success depends on no one but myself." The scale of women's participation in medieval commerce would shock most people today. York City records from 1415 show women owned 23% of all commercial properties in the city center. In medieval Cologne, the Brewers Guild was actually dominated by women. They controlled 78% of the city's beer production. These weren't small family operations either. Archaeological evidence from London reveals workshop complexes owned by women producing goods on almost industrial scales. What absolutely fascinates modern historians is how these businesswomen dealt with discrimination. Barred from most male-dominated guilds, they created their own professional organizations. Unable to easily travel for business, they developed sophisticated networks of female agents in other cities. Denied traditional banking access, they invented informal credit systems among themselves. Every obstacle became an opportunity for innovation. Their business correspondence reveals something remarkable about their mindset. They didn't see themselves as victims of a patriarchal system, but as entrepreneurs finding creative solutions to market challenges. A 1389 letter from Isabella La Merciere captures this attitude perfectly. "The men may have their guilds and laws, but we have our wits and will. I'd rather build my own ladder than wait for them to lower theirs." These women also understood reputation power in ways modern influencers would envy. In a world constantly questioning women's business abilities, they had to be not just good but exceptional, delivering superior products, maintaining impeccable integrity, and exceeding every expectation. The result? Many developed such strong personal brands that their names became synonymous with quality across entire regions. The financial independence these women achieved was truly revolutionary. They could travel freely, live where they chose, and most importantly, say no to marriage proposals from men who might limit their business activities. Account books of successful medieval businesswomen often include entries for what they called independence insurance, savings ensuring they'd never need to depend on a man for financial security. But for all their success, these remarkable entrepreneurs operated in a society fundamentally suspicious of their achievements. The very fact they could thrive independently challenged core assumptions about women's roles and capabilities. And as we'll discover next, this success came with a dark price. Because while these businesswomen were revolutionizing commerce and proving their capabilities, society's discomfort with independent women was building towards something sinister. The same qualities that made them successful, their independence, confidence, refusal to conform, would soon become evidence of something far more dangerous in the medieval mind. The connection between successful women and witchcraft accusations reveals our story's darkest chapter, showing the lengths society would go to control women who dared living on their own terms. The flames crackled higher as the crowd gathered in Würzburg's town square that cold morning in 1628. But this wasn't a celebration or festival, this was an execution. And the woman burning alive wasn't a criminal or heretic. Her crime? Being a successful businesswoman who had lived alone for 20 years, accumulated substantial wealth, and refused multiple marriage proposals. Her name was Anna Hansen, and according to trial records, her unnatural independence was primary evidence of her compact with the devil. Here's what will chill you to the bone. This wasn't unique. Between 1450 to 1750, an estimated 60,000 to 100,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe, 80 to 85% of them women. But the truly terrifying part most history books skip? A disproportionate number shared one crucial characteristic. They lived alone by choice, which trial records reveal an obvious pattern modern historians only noticed in the 1970s. Independent women, whether unmarried, widowed, or abandoned, were accused of witchcraft at rates far exceeding their population proportion. German historian Wolfgang Behringer's analysis of 16th-century Bavarian witch trials found single women were 12 times more likely to be accused than married women of identical age and status. Let me tell you about Margaretha Haar, whose 1627 Bamberg witch trial reads like a medieval entrepreneur's success story turned nightmare. She owned a prosperous tavern, had substantial savings, owned her home, and was known for sharp business acumen. But what made her dangerous in her community's eyes? She'd turned down 3 marriage proposals, claimed she was perfectly content living alone, and worst of all, was heard saying she needed no man to make her complete. The trial transcripts reveal the twisted logic condemning her. The prosecutor argued her contentment with single life was against nature, her business success was beyond a woman's natural capability, and her independence was proof of supernatural assistance. The fact she owned property was cited as evidence she'd sold her soul for worldly gain. She was tortured until confessing to carnal relations with demons, then burned alive in 1628. But here's where this story gets truly disturbing. The witch hunts weren't random religious hysteria. They systematically targeted the very women we've been celebrating. The independent, successful, autonomous women who'd proven marriage wasn't necessary for female happiness or prosperity. The Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, the infamous witch hunter's manual, essentially reads like a paranoid manifesto against female independence. Author Heinrich Kramer literally wrote that women living alone without male guidance were more susceptible to diabolic influence because they lacked the natural protection that submission to a husband provides. This wasn't just religious extremism. This was systematic terror designed to control female behavior. The economics of witch hunting reveals something even more sinister. Analysis of confiscated property records shows accused witches often had substantial assets seized by authorities upon arrest. Würzburg's Prince Bishop Julius Ector reportedly funded his entire cathedral renovation with wealth confiscated from executed witches. We're not talking about a few coins here. We're talking businesses, properties, and wealth representing decades of women's independent labor. What absolutely horrifies modern historians is how perfectly the witch hunts achieved their goal of terrorizing women into submission. The message was crystal clear: live independently, succeed too much, refuse marriage, and you might find yourself tied to a stake. Contemporary documents show many successful businesswomen began hastily arranging marriages, selling businesses, or retreating into convents. Anything to avoid appearing dangerously independent. The psychological warfare was brilliant in its cruelty. They didn't need to execute every independent woman, just enough to send a message. Village records across Germany show women abandoning successful enterprises, accepting unfavorable marriages, and surrendering hard-won independence rather than risk accusation. The witch hunts effectively destroyed centuries of progress in female economic independence. But here's what makes me angriest. The characteristics marking women as potential witches were exactly the traits that had made them successful. Confidence became arrogance. Business acumen became evidence of supernatural assistance. Independence became rebellion against God. Intelligence became dangerous cunning. They literally criminalized the very qualities that had allowed these women to thrive. The 1566 trial of Agnes Waterhouse in England perfectly illustrates this twisted logic. The prosecution's evidence included: she lived alone after her husband's death. She'd refused to remarry despite suitable offers. She maintained her household without male assistance. She was unusually clever with numbers, and neighbors testified she seemed remarkably content for a woman without a husband. These weren't crimes. They were achievements redefined as sins. Regional variations in which persecutions are telling. Areas with stronger traditions of female economic independence, like German states where women had historically participated heavily in trade, saw the most intense witch hunts. Conversely, regions where women had less economic autonomy experienced fewer accusations. The correlation is so strong that some historians argue the witch hunts were essentially an economic war against female independence disguised as religious purification. What's particularly heartbreaking is reading these condemned women's last words preserved in court records. Many express complete bewilderment at their fate. Margaret Barclay, executed in Scotland in 1618, reportedly said from the stake, "I lived as my mother taught me, worked as my hands allowed me, and harmed no soul. If this be witchcraft, then God help all women who dare to think for themselves." The witch hunt's long-term impact on female psychology cannot be overstated. For generations after the executions ended, women were raised understanding that too much independence, success, or contentment without a husband could be literally fatal. This psychological terrorism shaped female behavior for centuries, helping explain why it took so long for women to reclaim the economic and social freedoms their medieval predecessors had achieved. The irony is devastating. The very women who'd proved female independence was not only possible, but profitable, were systematically destroyed by a society that couldn't tolerate this truth. The witch hunts didn't just kill individual women. They murdered centuries of accumulated knowledge about how women could live autonomous, fulfilling lives. But even in this terror's face, some women refused to be cowed. Court records reveal women who maintained independence despite risks, supported accused neighbors despite danger, and quietly passed down knowledge that female autonomy was both possible and worthwhile. Their courage against systematic persecution is nothing short of heroic. The witch hunts eventually ended, but their psychological legacy lingered for centuries. The fear they instilled, that successful independent women were somehow unnatural or dangerous, became so deeply embedded in European culture that echoes persist today. Every time a successful woman is called cold or unnatural for prioritizing career over marriage, we're hearing whispers of that medieval terror campaign. Understanding this dark chapter helps explain why stories of independent medieval women were so thoroughly erased from popular history. Their very existence challenged narratives about women's natural need for male protection and guidance. Their success proved female dependence was a social construct, not biological necessity. And that truth was too dangerous to be allowed to survive. But here's what the witch hunters couldn't destroy: the fundamental truth these women had discovered. They'd proven female happiness, success, and fulfillment weren't dependent on male approval or traditional family structures. They demonstrated women were capable of extraordinary achievements when given freedom and opportunity. No amount of fire could burn away that reality. As we continue our journey through these hidden histories, we'll explore how society continued grappling with the problem of independent women. Because while witch hunts were the most extreme response, they weren't the only way medieval society tried controlling and limiting female autonomy. The language itself became a weapon, and the words we still use today carry scars of that linguistic warfare. Words have power, and in medieval Europe, They were about to become weapons of mass psychological destruction. While witch hunts terrorized women with fire and torture, an even more insidious campaign was quietly reshaping language itself. The goal? Ensure every word describing an unmarried woman carried shame, while every term for an unmarried man suggested freedom and choice. Here's something that'll make your blood boil. The word spinster originally had nothing to do with being unmarried. In 14th century England, it simply meant a woman who spins thread, a perfectly respectable profession. Spinsters were skilled artisans who could support themselves independently, much like we'd call someone a carpenter or blacksmith today. But watch what happens to this innocent occupational term over the centuries. By the 1600s, legal documents began using spinster as the official designation for any unmarried woman over 23, regardless of whether she actually spun thread. The Oxford English Dictionary shows that by 1719, the word had acquired its first negative connotation, described as meaning a woman still unmarried, especially one beyond the usual age for marriage. Notice that subtle shift? From skilled professional to woman who failed to marry on schedule. Now here's where the linguistic manipulation gets absolutely diabolical. While spinster was being transformed into an insult, what was happening to equivalent terms for men? The word bachelor comes from medieval Latin bacillarius, meaning young knight or novice farmer, both terms suggesting potential and promise. Unlike spinster, which became synonymous with failure, bachelor retained and even enhanced its positive associations. English court records from the 1500s reveal this double standard in action. Legal documents describing property transfers consistently refer to unmarried women as spinsters, by then carrying implications of deficiency, while unmarried men of identical age and circumstances were called bachelors, gentlemen, or simply merchants. Same legal status, completely different linguistic treatment. But the real genius of this linguistic warfare was how it embedded different expectations into the language itself. Let me show you something that'll absolutely astound you. Medieval law dictionaries define these terms with revealing precision. A 1581 legal manual describes a spinster as a woman who hath lived unmarried beyond the customary time, while defining a bachelor as a man who chooses to remain unmarried for his own purposes. Do you see the difference? Women failed to marry. Men chose not to marry. This wasn't accidental word choice. This was deliberate social engineering. The etymology reveals a systematic pattern. Terms describing unmarried women consistently evolved to suggest sadness, failure, or inadequacy. Old maid emerged in the 1520s carrying immediate negative connotations. On the shelf appeared in the 1600s, comparing women to unused goods. Meanwhile, terms for unmarried men, confirmed bachelor, eligible bachelor, man about town, suggested sophistication, choice, and desirability. The psychological impact of this linguistic manipulation was devastating and long-lasting. Court testimony from the 1600s shows women preemptively defending their unmarried status, using phrases like, "though I remain a spinster through no fault of my own," or "despite my unfortunate spinsterhood." These women had internalized shame about a life choice that just centuries earlier had been celebrated as independence and self-sufficiency. What's particularly insidious is how this language shaped not just how society viewed unmarried women, but how women viewed themselves. The Diary of Elizabeth L. Staub, an 18th century scholar, reveals the psychological damage. "I wake each morning reminded by the very word that describes me, spinster, that I'm considered a failure, though I've achieved more in scholarship than most men of my acquaintance." The economic implications of this linguistic shift were enormous. By the 1700s, business correspondence shows that being labeled a spinster could actually damage a woman's commercial credibility. Customers and suppliers began viewing unmarried businesswomen as potentially unstable or unsuccessful, while bachelor merchants were seen as focused and dedicated to their enterprises. The same lifestyle choice led to opposite commercial perceptions based entirely on gender. Here's what'll shock you about medieval attitudes toward unmarried men. They were actually encouraged to delay marriage to establish themselves professionally. Church sermons from the 1400s regularly advised young men to secure thy fortune before securing thy bride, while simultaneously warning that women who delayed marriage risked becoming burdens upon their families and objects of pity. The same behavior, prioritizing independence and financial security, was praised in men and condemned in women. The legal system reinforced these double standards with surgical precision. English common law allowed unmarried men to inherit property, make contracts, and conduct business without any questions about their personal choices. But unmarried women, despite having identical legal rights, faced constant scrutiny about why they remained unwed. Court records show judges regularly inquiring about spinsters' reasons for refusing marriage, as if their single status required justification. The marriage market itself operated on completely different principles for men and women. Men's value as potential husbands often increased with age and accomplishment. Older bachelors were seen as more established and desirable catches. But women faced the opposite trajectory. The same medieval documents that described 25-year-old bachelors as promising young men described 25-year-old spinsters as approaching dangerous territory regarding marriageability. Religious authorities played a crucial role in embedding these double standards into moral teaching. Sermons from the medieval period consistently portrayed unmarried women as incomplete or spiritually deficient, while treating unmarried men as simply not yet called to the blessed state of matrimony. The language itself suggested that women needed marriage to achieve wholeness, while men were already complete beings who might choose marriage as an addition to their lives. The persistence of these linguistic patterns is remarkable. Even today, we can see echoes of this medieval propaganda in modern language. Bachelorette parties celebrate a woman's last moments of freedom before marriage, implying marriage and female independence. But bachelor parties celebrate a man's choice to give up his freedom for love, suggesting sacrifice rather than completion. What makes this linguistic manipulation so effective is its subtlety. Unlike the obvious violence of witch hunts, language warfare operates below conscious awareness. People absorb these associations without questioning them, internalizing the idea that female independence is somehow unnatural or pitiable, while male independence represents choice and strength. The medieval chroniclers who documented these linguistic shifts seem to have understood exactly what they were doing. A 1534 treatise on proper Christian language explicitly states that words describing unmarried women should convey the sadness of their incomplete state, while terms for unmarried men should respect their deliberate choice to remain uncommitted. This wasn't unconscious bias. This was intentional social programming. But here's what gives me hope about this dark chapter. Some medieval women saw right through the manipulation. The letters of Lady Margaret Beaufort, who remained unmarried by choice for most of her adult life, show her deliberately using positive language to describe her status. She refers to herself as a woman of independent means rather than accepting the term spinster, and describes her unmarried friends as ladies of discernment rather than old maids. The economic records of successful unmarried women also reveal resistance to linguistic diminishment. Business contracts from the 1500s show women like merchant Agnes Darrett deliberately titling themselves as Agnes Darrett, merchant rather than Agnes Darrett, spinster, refusing to lead with their marital status in professional contexts. Understanding this linguistic warfare helps explain why stories of successful independent women were so thoroughly erased from popular culture. The language itself had been weaponized to make female independence seem tragic or unnatural. When the words we use to describe unmarried women carry built-in implications of failure or sadness, it becomes much easier to dismiss their achievements and ignore their happiness. But while society was busy rewriting the dictionary to shame independent women, some of the most remarkable women in medieval history were thriving behind convent walls, not as rejected spinsters seeking refuge, but as powerful leaders who had chosen spiritual independence over earthly marriage. Their stories reveal that the medieval world offered paths to female autonomy that we've completely forgotten. Next, we're entering the sacred halls where some of the most powerful women in medieval Europe wielded authority that would make modern CEOs envious. These weren't women who failed at marriage. These were women who chose something far more ambitious. What abbesses and prioresses achieved within their religious communities will revolutionize everything you thought you knew about medieval female power. Behind the towering stone walls of Fontevraud Abbey in 12th century France, something extraordinary was happening that would make modern corporate boards look like amateur hour. The woman pacing the marble floors of her private chambers wasn't some meek nun seeking refuge from the world. She was Abbess Petronilla de Chemel, and she controlled an empire spanning 4 countries, managed assets worth millions in today's currency, and commanded the loyalty of over 3,000 people. Oh, and she answered to absolutely no man on earth except the Pope himself. Here's what'll absolutely blow your mind about medieval convents. They weren't refuges for women who couldn't find husbands. They were the Harvard business schools of their time. The only institutions where brilliant women could rise to positions of real power without a man's permission. While the outside world was busy calling unmarried women failures, inside convent walls these same women were running multinational organizations, conducting international diplomacy, and accumulating wealth that would make today's Fortune 500 CEOs weep with envy. Let me tell you about Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who was so far ahead of her time that she seems almost supernatural. This woman didn't just run a convent. She built an intellectual empire. She composed symphonies still performed today, wrote medical texts used for centuries, corresponded with emperors and popes as an equal, and oh, by the way, claimed to receive visions directly from God. Her abbey's financial records show that under her leadership, the convent's wealth increased by 400% in 30 years. But here's where the story gets really fascinating. These abbesses had powers that even kings envied. They could excommunicate people, grant pardons, coin their own money, and maintain their own armies. The Abbey of Quedlinburg in Germany was ruled by abbesses who held the rank of imperial princess and had a seat in the imperial diet. They literally had more political power than most male nobles. The economic scale of these medieval convent enterprises is absolutely staggering. The Abbey of Shaftesbury in England, led by a succession of powerful abbesses, owned over 100,000 acres of land, collected rents from dozens of towns, operated multiple mills and breweries, and maintained trade relationships across Europe. The Domesday Book records show that in 1086, Shaftesbury Abbey was the second wealthiest landowner in all of England, surpassed only by the king himself. What makes these abbesses even more remarkable is how they navigated the politics of male-dominated society while maintaining their independence. Take Abbess Hugo of St. Denis. Wait, that's a man's name, right? Wrong. This was actually Abbess Jean de Dampmartin, who deliberately adopted masculine titles and signatures to command more respect in political negotiations. Her correspondence with the French royal court shows her successfully negotiating tax exemptions, territorial disputes, and trade agreements while never revealing her gender to distant correspondents. Here's something that'll give you chills about the intelligence of these women. They had figured out centuries before anyone else that economic independence equals political power. The account books of medieval convents read like masterclasses in diversified investment. They didn't just own land. They operated banks, funded trading expeditions, invested in new technologies, and essentially created the first venture capital networks in European history. The Abbess Herrad of Landsberg created what historians consider the world's first illustrated encyclopedia, the Hortus Deliciarum, which contained everything from astronomy to philosophy to practical medicine. But here's the kicker. She didn't write it for male scholars. She created it specifically as an educational text for women, proving that female intellectual capacity was equal to or superior to men's. The manuscript, though sadly destroyed in 1870, was copied extensively and influenced education across Europe for centuries. These convent leaders also revolutionized healthcare in ways that shaped modern medicine. The Abbey of Hôtel-Dieu in Paris, run by a succession of brilliant abbesses, operated the largest hospital in medieval Europe. Their medical records show survival rates that wouldn't be matched by secular hospitals until the 19th century. These women were performing complex surgeries, developing new pharmaceuticals, and training female physicians centuries before medical schools would admit women. But perhaps the most subversive thing these abbesses did was prove that female leadership could be superior to male authority. Contemporary chronicles repeatedly note that convents run by women were more financially stable, better organized, and more innovative than male-led monasteries. A 13th century papal report comparing religious institutions found that female-led houses were 60% more likely to be debt-free and 40% more likely to be expanding their operations. The international networks these women created would make modern multinational corporations envious. Abbess Matilda of Quedlinburg maintained regular correspondence with religious houses from Ireland to Poland, coordinating everything from manuscript copying to financial investments. Her letters reveal a woman who thought in terms of continental strategy and long-term economic planning. What's absolutely mind-blowing is how these abbesses handled what we'd now call work-life balance. Unlike the secular world where successful women were automatically labeled as unnatural or dangerous, within convent walls female ambition and intelligence were not just accepted, but celebrated as gifts from God. These women could pursue scholarship, artistic creation, political maneuvering, and business expansion without ever having to justify their choices or defend their right to independence. The educational innovations of these medieval abbesses were centuries ahead of their time. The Abbey of the Paraclete under Abbess Heloise, yes, the same Heloise from the famous love letters, developed what historians consider the first systematic curriculum for women's higher education. Their teaching methods emphasized logic, rhetoric, mathematics, and natural philosophy, creating generations of educated women who would influence European intellectual development. Here's where the story gets deliciously ironic. While the outside world was burning independent women as witches, these abbesses were accumulating more wealth, power, and influence than most secular rulers. They had discovered the perfect loophole in medieval misogyny by framing their ambitions in religious terms. They could achieve everything secular women were forbidden to attempt. The Abbess Matilda of Tuscany, not to be confused with the secular countess, controlled trade routes generating revenue equivalent to entire kingdoms. Her abbey's customs records show she was essentially operating a medieval import-export business, taking percentages from merchants crossing her territories while using profits to fund scholarship, arts, and further expansion. She was running what we'd now call a private equity firm, except she was accountable only to God. These women also understood public relations in ways modern politicians would admire. They consistently framed their wealth accumulation and power consolidation as services to God and community, making it nearly impossible for critics to attack them without appearing to oppose divine will. The chronicles of their time repeatedly describe them as blessed with unusual wisdom and favored by divine providence, language that protected them from accusations of unnaturalness that destroyed secular independent women. The manuscript collections of these abbesses reveal women who were genuinely happy with their choices. Their personal writings describe deep satisfaction with their work, pride in their achievements, and gratitude for their independence. Unlike the apologetic tone we see in writings of secular spinsters, these women wrote with confidence and joy about their roles as leaders and innovators. But here's what makes their story even more remarkable. They were preparing for a future they knew was coming. Many abbesses established endowments and legal structures designed to protect female independence long after their deaths. They were building institutions that could survive changes in political climate and social attitudes, creating lasting legacies that would benefit women for generations. However, even as these remarkable abbesses were proving female leadership capabilities within religious walls, the secular world continued struggling with a fundamental question. If women could be so successful and content living independently, why did society insist they needed husbands to be complete? The answer to this puzzle lies in understanding how medieval dating and relationships actually worked. Because while we've been exploring stories of women who chose independence, there's another side to this tale. The women who wanted love and companionship, but refused to settle for relationships that would diminish their autonomy. Their strategies for finding equal partnerships in an unequal world reveal that medieval romance was far more complex and strategic than any fairy tale would have you believe. Imagine swiping right in 1387, except your dating profile is a handwritten letter carefully crafted by a professional scribe. The profile reads, "Seeking gentlemen of good character for intellectual companionship and mutual respect. Must appreciate independent lady who owns property, speaks 3 languages, and has strong opinions about Italian poetry. Dowry negotiable, but autonomy non-negotiable." This isn't fiction. This is an actual personal advertisement from London Guild records placed by Thomasina Sina de Ashby, revealing that medieval dating was far more strategic, sophisticated, and female-driven than any Hollywood portrayal would suggest. Here's what will completely revolutionize how you think about medieval romance. The most successful daters weren't helpless damsels waiting to be rescued, but independent businesswomen, educated ex-abbesses, and wealthy widows who knew exactly what they wanted and weren't afraid to negotiate for it. These women had cracked the code of medieval romance by understanding something modern dating coaches are still preaching. The best relationships are partnerships between equals, not rescues between unequals. Let me introduce you to Marie La Mercière, a 13th century French merchant who essentially invented speed dating. Tired of suitors more interested in her inheritance than her intellect, she established mercantile salons, gatherings where unmarried professionals could meet, discuss business, and evaluate each other as potential partners. Her correspondence, preserved in Montpellier's municipal archives, describes these events with delicious detail. "I have devised a most efficient method for evaluating gentlemen. They must demonstrate wit through discourse, character through business dealings, and respect through proper attention to the ladies' opinions." Marie's system had an extraordinary success rate. Of 47 couples who met at her salons between 1267 to 1275, church records show 39 marriages resulted with only 3 separations, a divorce rate under 8% in an era when arranged marriages often failed within a decade. But here's where medieval dating gets truly innovative. These independent women developed compatibility testing centuries before psychology existed. The letters of Marguerite d'Avar reveal an elaborate vetting process requiring suitors to demonstrate domestic skills, financial management abilities, and crucially, comfort with female authority. One hilarious letter describes making a suitor manage her household accounts for a week to see if he can appreciate a woman's work without seeking to control it. The economic negotiations around these partnerships were fascinatingly complex. Unlike traditional arranged marriages where women were essentially property transfers, these independent women negotiated prenuptial agreements that would impress modern divorce lawyers. The Testament of Agnes Ferrier includes marriage contracts specifying everything from business partnership terms to household management divisions to clauses protecting her right to travel for trade. What's absolutely remarkable is how these women used economic independence as relationship leverage. They could afford to be choosy, reject unsuitable suitors, and negotiate for partnerships that enhanced rather than diminished their lives. The Diary of Isabella Andréani captures this perfectly. "I have spent 15 years building my fortune and reputation. Any man seeking my hand must prove he will add to both, not subtract from either." Medieval dating strategies often involved what we'd now call trial periods. Florentine court records describe courtship contracts, where couples would live in separate but neighboring properties for a year, collaborating on business ventures and social obligations to test compatibility before committing to marriage. It was medieval cohabitation, but with more legal structure and clearer exit clauses. The role of female friendship networks in medieval dating cannot be overstated. Independent women created sophisticated referral systems, sharing information about suitors' reputations, financial stability, and treatment of previous partners. Correspondence between successful businesswomen reads like early Yelp reviews, detailed assessments of men's character, habits, and suitability for partnership with independent women. Here's something that'll make you laugh. Medieval women developed tests for evaluating male attitudes toward female independence. One popular strategy involved deliberately outperforming men in negotiations early in courtship to see their reactions. Women would showcase superior knowledge of politics or trade, or demonstrate financial independence to weed out men threatened by capable women. The success stories emerging from these strategic approaches are genuinely heartwarming. The marriage records of Thomas and Margaret Paton reveal a partnership modern couples would envy. Their correspondence shows mutual respect, shared business decisions, intellectual collaboration, and genuine romantic love. Margaret signs letters, "Your equal partner in all things," while Thomas refers to her as "my most trusted advisor and dearest companion." But perhaps the most subversive aspect was how they redefined romantic success. Instead of measuring victory by securing any husband, these women sought partnerships enhancing their happiness and expanding possibilities. They wanted what we'd now call relationship added value. Connections making their already fulfilling lives even richer. The international scope of medieval dating networks is fascinating. Successful women often sought partners across national boundaries using trade connections to meet compatible men from other regions. The marriage of Caterina Schwartz to Giovanni di Albinio was arranged through female merchants who identified mutual business interests and compatible personalities across Italian city-states. These women also pioneered lifestyle compatibility testing. They insisted on partners sharing values around work, independence, and mutual respect. The marriage contract of Jacqueline Du includes clauses requiring her husband to respect my business travels, support my charitable endeavors, and never interfere with my financial decisions without invitation. What makes these medieval dating strategies impressive is how they balanced romantic desire with practical concerns. The personal letters revealed genuine affection and passion, but these were also strategic partnerships between people understanding that sustainable love requires mutual respect, shared values, and compatible life goals. The failure stories are equally instructive. Court records document cases of successful businesswomen marrying controlling men, resulting in financial ruin and personal misery, serving as cautionary tales about careful partner selection. These medieval women understood something modern dating culture still struggles with: the difference between settling for companionship and holding out for true partnership. They were willing to remain single rather than compromise hard-won independence for relationships diminishing their lives. Their approach was both pragmatic and idealistic, wanting love, but only if it came with respect, equality, and mutual enhancement. The most successful couples created what historians call power partnerships, relationships where both parties brought substantial assets, skills, and networks to create combined households more influential than either could achieve alone. However, understanding how these remarkable women approached romance raises a crucial question about the economic foundations making their independence possible. Because behind every successful medieval dating strategy was a woman who had first mastered the art of financial self-sufficiency. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval female independence: the sophisticated economic systems these women developed to build and maintain wealth. Their approaches to money management, investment, and financial planning were so advanced that they influenced European banking for centuries. The secrets of medieval women's wealth-building strategies reveal principles that remain surprisingly relevant for anyone seeking financial independence today. Follow the money, as they say, and when you trace gold coins through medieval Europe, they lead to an absolutely shocking discovery. Some of the continent's wealthiest individuals weren't kings, merchant princes, or even male. They were single women who had mastered medieval capitalism so thoroughly that their financial strategies would make Warren Buffett take notes. These women didn't stumble into wealth. They engineered it with precision, revealing financial intelligence centuries ahead of its time. Here's what will completely revolutionize how you think about medieval economics. Independent women were operating the world's first hedge funds. Take Mahat d'Artois, a 14th century French countess who chose to remain unmarried after her husband's death. Her financial records reveal investment strategies that wouldn't seem out of place in a modern portfolio. She diversified across agriculture, manufacturing, shipping, real estate, and what can only be described as medieval venture capital, funding new technologies and startups across France and Flanders. The numbers are staggering. By 1315, Mahat's annual income was approximately 80,000 livres, equivalent to roughly $15 million today. But here's the kicker. She wasn't inheriting this wealth, she was generating it. Her account books show she multiplied her modest inheritance by 2,000% over 20 years through strategic investments, currency speculation, and private equity deals. Now you might think Mahat was some financial genius anomaly, but prepare to have your mind blown. Venetian tax records from 1379 reveal that unmarried women controlled 31% of the city's private wealth despite representing only 8% of the adult population. That's nearly 4 times the wealth concentration you'd expect from random distribution. These women weren't just rich. They were systematically, strategically, brilliantly rich. Let me introduce you to the medieval equivalent of a cryptocurrency pioneer, Jacoba Felici, a 14th century Parisian who revolutionized medical practice by creating the first subscription-based healthcare system. Instead of charging per visit like traditional physicians, she sold annual health packages to wealthy families guaranteeing medical care for a fixed fee. Her innovation was so successful that within 5 years, she had over 200 subscriber families and was earning more than court physicians who had tried banning her from practicing. The economic advantages of medieval singlehood were enormous, but you had to be smart enough to exploit them. Unmarried women could own property in their own names, make contracts without male consent, and most importantly, kept 100% of their earnings. Meanwhile, married women legally owned nothing. Every penny automatically belonged to their husbands. The economic incentive for remaining single was so powerful that some women avoided marriage even when they had romantic relationships. Here's something that'll blow your mind about medieval financial planning. These women were creating trust funds and investment vehicles operating across generations. The Testament of Alessandra Masinghi Strozzi reveals a financial structure so sophisticated it includes international currency hedging, diversified real estate holdings across 3 countries, and endowment funds designed to support other women's business ventures in perpetuity. The scale of women's economic networks was truly international. Margherita Dattini maintained business relationships with suppliers in England, customers in Constantinople, and financial partners in Bruges. Her correspondence reveals a woman running a medieval multinational corporation complete with foreign exchange calculations, risk management strategies, and market analysis reading like a modern business school case study. But perhaps the most innovative aspect was their approach to social impact investing. These women consistently funded projects benefiting other women while generating profitable returns. They established loan programs for female entrepreneurs, created scholarship funds for girls' education, and invested in technologies reducing domestic labor, essentially building an economy supporting female independence while enriching themselves. The property investment strategies were particularly brilliant. Instead of just buying land like most wealthy men, they focused on income-generating urban properties. London tax records show women owned 67% of all commercial rental properties in the city center by the 14th century. They'd cornered the market on the medieval equivalent of apartment buildings and office complexes. Here's what makes these medieval financiers even more impressive. They operated without banks, credit cards, or modern financial instruments. Everything was done through personal relationships, written contracts, and careful reputation management. Account books reveal elaborate systems of credit, debt management, and risk assessment requiring extraordinary mathematical skill and business acumen. The investment clubs formed by wealthy medieval women were centuries ahead of their time. Groups of unmarried women would pool resources to fund large projects, shipping expeditions, manufacturing ventures, even early mining operations. The Libro di Ricordanze documents 12 Florentine women collectively funding a silk trading expedition to the Orient, sharing risks and profits according to carefully negotiated percentages. What absolutely fascinates modern economists is how these women handled market volatility. During the 1346 to 1353 financial crisis triggered by Edward III loan default, male-dominated businesses were devastated, but women's account books show remarkably stable performance. Why? They diversified across countries and industries, maintained larger cash reserves, and avoided the high-risk strategies that ruined male competitors. The currency speculation conducted by medieval businesswomen was particularly sophisticated. They understood different regions used different monetary systems and actively traded currencies to profit from exchange rate fluctuations. The records of Margaret Russell show her regularly converting between English pounds, Flemish gros, Venetian ducats, and Florentine florins, making profits on spreads while hedging against devaluation. These women also pioneered what we now call lifestyle business models. Enterprises designed to generate enough income to support desired living standards while maximizing personal freedom. Unlike male entrepreneurs often pursuing growth for its own sake, successful women typically optimized for sustainability, flexibility, and work-life balance. The retirement planning was remarkably forward-thinking. They consistently set aside larger income percentages for old age than male counterparts, understanding they couldn't rely on children or male relatives for support. The will of Agnes Pothun reveals she'd accumulated enough wealth to live comfortably for 30 years without additional income. But here's what really sets these medieval women apart. They understood that wealth without agency was meaningless. They consistently chose financial strategies, preserving independence and decision-making power, even when other approaches might have been more profitable. They'd rather earn less as autonomous individuals than earn more as dependent wives or business partners. The charitable giving patterns also reveal sophisticated financial thinking. Rather than making large one-time donations like most wealthy men, they created endowments and trusts designed to provide ongoing support for causes they cared about, essentially creating the first impact investment funds generating social returns alongside financial ones. What strikes me most is how they balanced aggressive wealth accumulation with careful risk management. These women understood their economic independence was fragile. Social attitudes could change, laws could be revised, political upheavals could threaten their position. So they built financial fortresses designed to withstand any storm. The record-keeping systems developed by successful businesswomen were extraordinarily detailed and organized. They had to be, because unlike men who could rely on guild protections or family support, women's business success depended entirely on their ability to prove competence and reliability. Their account books read like monuments to female analytical intelligence. However, all this financial success raises a fascinating question. If medieval women could achieve such extraordinary economic independence and prosperity, why weren't there more of them? The answer lies in understanding not just the opportunities available to exceptional women, but the remarkable individuals who seize those opportunities. Because while we've explored the systems and strategies making female independence possible, we haven't yet met the specific women who became legends. The stories of the most famous medieval spinsters reveal personalities so compelling and achievements so extraordinary that they challenge everything we think we know about what was possible for women in the medieval world, and introduce us to the medieval woman who literally changed the course of European history while never once wearing a wedding ring.